You don't just stop a freight train. When you have 10,000 tons of steel pushing you from behind, stopping takes miles. It takes planning. It takes physics. But last Tuesday, my train stopped in 3 seconds. My name is Ford, and I've been an engineer on the night shift for 20 years. I was driving a heavy cargo hauler through the Helix Tunnel deep inside the mountains. It was 3:00 a.m. The tunnel is 5 miles long, a straight shot of wet concrete and darkness. I was drinking my coffee, watching the tracks in the yellow beam of the headlights. The ride was smooth. The diesel engine was humming like a giant cat. Then the world ended. We didn't hit a deer. We didn't hit a bear. I know what that feels like. A bear is just a soft thump under the wheels. You barely feel it in the cab. This felt like we hit a brick wall. Wham! The impact was violent. It threw me right out of my chair. I slammed into the glass windshield hard enough to crack it. My coffee cup exploded against the dashboard, spraying hot liquid everywhere. Behind me, the whole train screamed. It was the sound of metal tearing against metal. The emergency brakes locked up automatically. Sparks flew past the window like fireworks, lighting up the tunnel walls in angry orange flashes. The smell hit me instantly. It smelled like burnt sand and hot iron. The train shuddered and slid, fighting against the rails, screeching so loud my ears popped. I tried to grab the console to pull myself up, but the G-force pinned me to the floor. The locomotive was sliding sideways, the wheels grinding flat spots into the steel rails. We were skidding for what felt like forever, deeper and deeper into the dark. Then, just as fast as it started, the noise stopped. The train groaned one last time and settled. We were dead in the water. The silence in the tunnel was heavy. It pressed against my eardrums. The engine had stalled out from the shock. The lights flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness except for the faint glow of the emergency panel. I gasped for air, tasting the bitter tang of brake dust. My chest hurt where I had hit the console. Physics, I whispered to myself, trying to make sense of it. That wasn't physics. I grabbed my radio, my hands shaking. "Kowalski," I yelled. "Kowalski, come in. Are you okay back there?" Kowalski was my conductor. He was in the rear engine, a mile behind me. He should have answered right away. He usually complained the second the brakes applied too hard. But the radio didn't crackle, it didn't hiss. It was just dead silence. I sat there in the dark, listening to the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine. I wiped the blood from my lip and looked out the windshield. The yellow headlights were flickering, casting long, dying shadows against the tunnel walls. I realized something then that made my blood run cold. We hit something big enough to stop a freight train instantly. But I was staring directly at the tracks ahead of me, and they were empty. I stared at the dashboard, waiting for the needles to move, but they were dead. The main reservoir gauge was flat at 0. The brake pipe pressure was gone. That meant one thing: we had ruptured a line. The train wasn't just stopped, it was bled out. Without air pressure, the brakes were locked tight. We were essentially a 10,000-ton paperweight sitting 2 miles deep in the belly of the mountain. "Dispatch, do you copy?" I tried the radio again. Static hissed back at me, mocking and cold. I knew the drill. The Helix Tunnel cuts through solid granite. Radio waves don't penetrate this deep. We were on our own. I unbuckled my safety harness and stood up. My legs felt shaky, like I had just stepped off a roller coaster. I grabbed my heavy coat from the hook behind the seat. It was thick canvas, stained with years of grease and diesel soot, but it was the only armor I had. I zipped it up to my chin. Then I reached for the maglite clipped to the door. It was an old-school flashlight, the kind made of heavy aluminum that feels like a steel pipe in your hand. I clicked it on. The beam was bright and steady, cutting through the dust floating in the cab. "All right, Kowalski," I muttered to the empty seat. "I'm coming to get you." I grabbed the portable radio, clipped it to my belt, and pushed open the heavy steel door of the locomotive. The change was instant. Inside the cab, it had been 70 degrees and smelled of coffee. Outside, it was a tomb. The air hit me like a physical slap, freezing, damp, and smelling of wet limestone and stagnant water. I stepped out onto the metal walkway, the steel grating clanging under my boots. The silence was the worst part. A train is supposed to be loud. It's supposed to hum and vibrate. But now the beast was dead. The only sound in that massive black throat of a tunnel was water. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from the ceiling, filtering down through miles of rock to land on the gravel ballast below. In the dark, it sounded loud. It sounded like a clock counting down. I shined my light down the side of the train. The beam faded into the mist after 50 yards. I couldn't see the rear engine. I couldn't see the tunnel exit. I was trapped in a stone tube. I had a choice to make. I needed to check on Kowalski, but he was a mile back. Before I made that long walk in the dark, I had to know what had stopped us. I had to see what we hit. I climbed down the ladder, my boots crunching onto the loose rocks of the track bed. I walked toward the front of the train, toward the pilot. My breath puffed out in white clouds in the flashlight beam. I kept my hand on the cold steel of the train, using it as a guide. I didn't want to look. Part of me was terrified I would see a car crushed underneath us, or worse. But I forced myself to turn the corner of the engine and shine the light on the front coupler. I needed to see the damage, and I needed to know why the track ahead was empty. I walked around the front of the locomotive, keeping one hand on the cold railing. My flashlight beam shook a little. I told myself it was just the cold, but deep down, I knew it was the fear. You don't crash a train and just walk away calm. I aimed the light at the pilot, the cowcatcher. That's the heavy steel plow on the front of the engine designed to push debris off the tracks. It's a solid sheet of reinforced iron, 2 inches thick. It can hit a pickup truck at 50 miles an hour and barely get a scratch. I stopped dead in my tracks. The pilot was destroyed. It wasn't just dented, it was caved in. The solid steel was bent inward like a crushed soda can. The metal was torn at the edges, jagged and sharp. I stared at it, trying to make the math work in my head. To do this to a locomotive, you would need a force that I couldn't even imagine. Another train could do it, maybe a boulder the size of a house. But the track was empty. No boulder, no other train, just the empty, wet rails stretching out into the dark. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on the gravel. I needed to see what we hit. I was expecting a mess. If we hit an animal big enough to buckle steel, there should be blood everywhere. There should be fur, bone, meat. It should look like a slaughterhouse. I shined the light right into the center of the dent. There was no blood, there was no red. "What is that?" I whispered. The torn steel was covered in something else. It was a thick, frothy white foam. It looked like saliva, but it was thick, dripping in long, sticky strings. I leaned in closer, and the smell hit me. It didn't smell like diesel or copper. It smelled like a wet dog. But it wasn't a normal smell. It was heavy and thick, like rotting fur and musk amplified 1,000 times. It stung my eyes. It was the smell of a predator that had been living in the dark for a long time. I reached out a gloved hand, tempted to touch the white foam, but then I heard a sound. The saliva was sizzling. The metal of the pilot was still hot from the friction of the crash, and the foam was boiling slightly, releasing little wisps of steam that vanished into the cold tunnel air. I pulled my hand back fast. My brain was running through the options, crossing them off one by one. A bear dies when you hit it. It doesn't leave this much saliva. A rock slide shatters. It doesn't smell like musk. I looked at the massive dent again. Something had stood on the tracks, taken a hit from 12,000 tons of moving steel and simply pushed back. And whatever it wasn't here anymore. I shined my light into the darkness ahead of the train one last time. Nothing. A cold feeling started in my stomach and spread to my chest. We weren't alone in this tunnel. And now, I had to walk a mile back in the dark to find Kowalski. I turned my back on the sizzling saliva and the destroyed pilot. The fear was sitting heavy in my stomach now, cold and hard like a stone. I needed to find Kowalski. He was a mile back in the rear pusher unit, probably wondering why we had stopped so hard. Or worse, maybe he was hurt. I started the long walk back along the length of the train. Walking inside a tunnel isn't like walking on a sidewalk. It's tight. We call it the crush zone. To my right was the wall of the train, steel wheels, grease, and massive iron couplers. To my left was the tunnel wall, wet, jagged rock that felt like ice. There was maybe 3 feet of space between them. I had to turn my shoulders sideways to fit, shuffling my feet over the loose, sharp gravel. Every step was loud, crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound echoed down the concrete tube, sounding like someone was walking right behind me. I stopped twice to look over my shoulder, swinging the heavy beam of my maglite into the dark behind me. Nothing, just the empty track and the dripping water. I kept moving. I counted the cars as I passed them to keep my mind focused. 1, 2, 3. They were mostly standard boxcars, rusting and covered in graffiti. Then I reached car number 7. I stopped. My flashlight beam caught something that didn't look right. The first 6 cars were smooth and straight, but car number 7, a high-cube boxcar marked as sealed cargo, was ruined. The heavy steel sliding door on the side wasn't just open, it was destroyed. I stepped closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. I've seen boxcar doors get stuck. I've seen them rust shut, but I have never seen steel torn like paper. The metal of the door had been ripped open. The jagged edges were curled outward, pointing toward me. I stared at it, trying to understand what I was seeing. If something had hit the train from the outside, like that bear I told myself we hit, the metal would be bent inward, pushed into the car. But this metal was peeled back like a banana skin. The force had come from the inside. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my knuckles turning white. I checked the manifest in my head. This train was supposed to be hauling auto parts and paper rolls. Car number 7 was listed as empty for repairs. It wasn't supposed to be carrying anything. I slowly raised my light, aiming the beam into the gaping black hole where the door used to be. The beam cut through the dust and illuminated the wooden floor of the boxcar. It wasn't empty. Bolted to the floor were 4 heavy steel plates, and attached to those plates were chains. These weren't small chains. They were thick, industrial anchor chains, the kind you use to tie down a bulldozer. But they weren't holding anything down anymore. They were snapped. I saw the heavy steel links lying on the floor, twisted and sheared off. The metal shackles were bent straight. Whatever had been chained in the center of that car didn't just get loose. It had pulled hard enough to snap solid iron. I stepped back, hitting the wet tunnel wall with my shoulder. The cold water soaked through my coat, but I didn't feel it. I was too busy staring at the scratches on the floor, deep gouges in the wood leading right to the door. Something had been locked inside this train, something strong enough to break chains and tear through a steel wall. And now the chains were empty, the door was open. We hadn't hit a wall, we hadn't hit a monster, we were transporting one, and the crash didn't stop the train. The crash happened because the cargo woke up. I looked down the long, dark tunnel toward the rear engine where Kowalski was waiting. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The thing that broke out of this car wasn't in front of me. It was behind me, and it was heading the same way I was. I ran the rest of the way. I didn't care about the noise anymore. The sound of my boots slamming on the gravel echoed like gunshots, but I kept moving. The image of those broken chains was burned into my mind. I needed to get to Kowalski. We needed to lock ourselves in the cab and call for help until someone heard us. Kowalski! I screamed as the shape of the rear locomotive finally loomed out of the darkness. It was running dark. The interior lights were off. The engine was silent, just like mine. But something was wrong. The heavy steel door on the side of the cab, the one that's supposed to be latched tight while moving, was swinging gently back and forth. Creak, bang, creak, bang. I slowed down, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I raised my flashlight, aiming the beam at the open doorway. Kowalski. No answer. I grabbed the handrail and pulled myself up the ladder. The metal was slippery. I stepped into the cab, swinging my light around the small space. My stomach dropped. The cab was destroyed. It wasn't just messy. It looked like a bomb had gone off inside. The heavy engineer's chair, bolted to the floor, was ripped from its mountings and thrown into the corner. The upholstery was shredded, yellow foam padding scattered everywhere like snow. The digital display screens on the control stand were smashed, spider webs of cracks obscuring the glass. I swept the light across the floor. Papers were everywhere, manifests, schedules, logs soaked in coffee, and something else. Kowalski, I yelled again, but the sound died in my throat. He wasn't there. I looked at the side windows. They were made of reinforced safety glass, designed to stop a rock at 60 miles an hour. They were shattered, but just like the boxcar door, the glass was pushed outward. Whatever did this had been inside the cab with him. I stepped deeper into the wreckage, my boots crunching on glass. I saw something lying near the heater. It was a handheld radio. I bent down and picked it up. It was crushed. The thick plastic casing was cracked right down the middle, like someone had squeezed it in a vise. I turned it over. There was a smear on the back. It was that same thick white saliva. I dropped the radio. I didn't want to touch it. The smell of wet, rotting dog fur was stronger here. It was suffocating. I shined my light on the floor again, looking for blood, looking for a body, but there was no red, just the foam. And then I saw the trail. In the dust on the floor there were footprints, but they weren't boot prints. They were massive, muddy prints. They looked like a wolf's paw, but they were huge, easily the size of a dinner plate. And they had fingers. The claws had dug deep gouges into the floor mat. I followed them with my light. They led out the door, down the stairs, and onto the gravel ballast. I leaned out of the cab, tracing the path of the prints. They didn't go off into the tunnel. They didn't go toward the exit. They turned around. The muddy trail led back along the tracks, heading straight toward the front of the train, straight toward my engine. I realized then why the track ahead of me had been empty. The thing hadn't run away. It had circled back. It had come here, taken Kowalski, and now it was heading back to finish the job. I was a mile away from safety, standing in a dead man's cab, and the hunter was between me and the only lockable door left. I stood on the metal walkway of the rear engine, staring at the muddy trail that led back into the dark. My brain was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt heavy. The creature, whatever it was, had taken Kowalski, and now it was heading back to the front. My only way out was the front engine. It had the only radio that might still work, and it had the only door I could lock from the inside. But to get there, I had to walk a mile through the same tunnel where that thing was hunting. I looked at my flashlight. The beam was bright, white, and powerful. It was also a beacon. If I walked down that track with a light shining, I was just a target with a bullseye on my chest. I took a deep breath, terrified of what I was about to do. Click. I turned the flashlight off. The darkness was instant and total. It felt like someone had wrapped a heavy wool blanket around my head. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I couldn't see the floor. I was blind. I reached out with my left hand and found the cold, wet steel of the coal car next to me. That was my lifeline. As long as I could feel the train, I knew I wasn't lost. I started to walk. I moved slowly, sliding my boots over the gravel so I wouldn't crunch the rocks. Slide, step, slide, step. I kept my hand flat against the side of the train, feeling the rivets and the rust. The tunnel was quiet again. Drip, drip, drip. But after 5 minutes, the sound changed. It wasn't a footstep on gravel. It was a sound coming from above me. Crunch. It was the sound of something heavy shifting its weight. It sounded like stone grinding against stone. It was coming from the ceiling of the tunnel. I froze, pressing my back flat against the train. I held my breath until my lungs burned. Sniff, sniff. The sound was wet and loud. It was the sound of a massive animal testing the air. It was moving forward toward the front of the train just like me. I waited until the sound faded a little. Then I took a few more steps. Crunch. Click. The sound stopped when I stopped. It moved when I moved. My heart hammered against my ribs. It knew. It couldn't see me in the dark, but it could hear me. It was packing me. I kept moving, trying to be quieter than a ghost. I needed to see where it was. I needed a reference point. Then, about 100 yards ahead, I saw a faint glow. It was a signal repeater, a small red light mounted on the wall of the tunnel to tell engineers the track's status. It wasn't bright, just a dull, crimson eye in the dark. But it was enough. I crept closer, keeping my eyes locked on that patch of red light. The tunnel ceiling was visible now, just a vague gray arch above the black shape of the train. I watched the ceiling as I walked into the red glow. Then I saw the shadow. It wasn't on the train. It was on the roof of the tunnel. Something was clinging to the wet concrete, 20 feet above the ground. In the red light, it looked like a monster from a nightmare. It was huge, easily 7 feet long even while crouched. I squinted, trying to make sense of the shape. It had 4 limbs, but they were massive. The arms were thick with muscle, ending in hands that looked like claws. The legs were bunched up against the rock, powerful and coiled. It wasn't a spider, it was a wolf. It was hanging upside down, its massive claws dug deep into the cracks of the concrete ceiling. It was covered in patchy, white fur that looked pink in the red light. I saw the silhouette of a long, tapered snout. I saw the pointed ears twitching, tracking my movement. It was a dogman, a massive albino dogman clinging to the roof of the tunnel like a gecko. It was moving perfectly in sync with me. I stopped walking. Above me, the shadow stopped instantly. The massive head slowly rotated downward. It hung there in the empty air, looking straight down at the tracks. It sniffed again, a low growl vibrating in its throat. It wasn't hunting by sight, it was hunting by scent, and I was standing right underneath it. I stared up at the massive, white shape clinging to the tunnel ceiling. The red signal light cast long shadows across its powerful shoulders. It hung there, suspended upside down, its claws dug deep into the concrete like grappling hooks. It was waiting for a sound. It was waiting to pinpoint me. I held my breath until my chest ached, pressing my hand against the cold steel of the coal car to steady myself. Don't move, I told myself. Don't even blink. But fear makes you clumsy. As I shifted my weight just a fraction of an inch, my boot slipped on a loose piece of gravel. Crunch. The sound was tiny. It was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the Helix Tunnel, it sounded like a gunshot. The reaction was instant. The creature didn't screech. It released a low, vibrating growl that shook the air in my lungs. It dropped from the ceiling, falling 20 feet through the darkness. It didn't land like a cat. It landed like a boulder. Thud. The impact shook the ground under my feet. I felt the wind of its landing hit the back of my legs. The smell of wet, musky fur and copper filled the air instantly. It was close. It was right there. I didn't think, I didn't plan, I just ran. I pushed off the side of the train and sprinted into the darkness. Running on railroad ballast is like trying to run on a beach made of knives. The loose rocks shifted and rolled under my boots, stealing my speed, trying to twist my ankles with every step. I kept my left hand out, scraping against the wet tunnel wall to keep my balance, while my right hand pumped frantically. Behind me, the silence was gone. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was the sound of heavy paws digging into the stones. It wasn't running on two legs anymore. It had dropped to all fours to hunt. It was fast, terrifyingly fast. I didn't dare turn on my flashlight. I knew the track by memory. I knew I had to be close to the front engine. "Come on, Ford," I gasped, the cold air burning my lungs. "Move." I stumbled, my knee smashing into a wooden railroad tie. Pain shot up my leg, white-hot and blinding. I almost went down. I caught myself on a steel wheel, my gloves sliding on the grease. G-R-R-R-R-R-R. The sound was right behind my ear, a deep, guttural snarl that sounded like a chainsaw idling. I scrambled up, ignoring the pain, and threw myself forward. Then I saw it, the faint, yellow reflection of my own headlights bouncing off the tunnel walls ahead, the lead locomotive, my sanctuary. I saw the rear ladder of the engine looming out of the dark. It was 10 yards away, 5 yards. The heavy footsteps behind me turned into a frenzy. It knew I was escaping. I could hear the massive creature panting, heavy, wet breaths as it closed the gap. It was lunging. I reached the ladder. I grabbed the cold metal rungs with both hands and hauled myself up. My boots slipped on the bottom step, scrambling for purchase. For a split second, I hung there, suspended between the safety of the walkway and the beast waiting in the dark. I felt the air pressure change behind me. I felt a wave of heat, humid, rotting heat, wash over the back of my neck. It was right there. If I reached back, I would touch its fur. I knew if I slipped, I would never see daylight again. Before I tell you what slammed against the door, and what that thing actually looked like when I finally saw its face, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. The railroad buries these reports. We broadcast them. Don't miss the next run. I threw my weight forward, vaulting onto the metal catwalk of the engine. I didn't look back. I didn't check the mirror. I lunged for the heavy steel door of the cab. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, diving inside the warm, dimly lit cab. I spun around, grabbing the locking wheel with both hands. Slam! Something massive hit the door from the outside just as the latch clicked home. The entire locomotive rocked on its suspension. The steel door groaned, the metal bowing inward for a second before snapping back. I fell backward onto the floor, gasping for air, staring at the door. Then silence. I waited. My heart was hammering so loud I could hear it in my ears. Then a face appeared in the small, reinforced window of the door. It was covered in white, patchy fur, stained with black grease from the tracks. It had a long, canine snout that was pressed tight against the glass, fogging it up with hot breath. But it was the eyes that froze my blood. They weren't human. They were bright, burning amber with vertical slit pupils like a reptile. They were locked onto me. The creature didn't look like a wild animal. It looked intelligent. It looked angry. And then slowly, it pulled its lips back to reveal rows of yellow, serrated teeth. It was smiling. The heavy steel door shuddered one last time, then went still. The face in the window vanished. I stayed on the floor, my back pressed against the heater, staring at the latch. It held. But I wasn't safe. I was just trapped. I scrambled up into the engineer's seat. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the console. I looked at the gauges. Everything was dead. The engine had stalled when we hit the emergency brakes. 0 RPMs. 0 air pressure. I was sitting in a glass box, inside a mountain with no way to move. Scritch and scritch. The sound came from the front now. It wasn't at the door anymore. It was climbing. I heard the sharp click of massive claws dragging across the metal nose of the locomotive. It was crawling over the hood, right toward the windshield. I held my breath. The cab was dark, lit only by the faint green glow of the emergency dash lights. Then a massive shadow blocked out the tunnel darkness. It slid down from the roof, and landed on the nose of the train, right in front of the glass. I froze. In the faint green light of the dashboard, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was a dogman, but it wasn't like the stories. It was albino. Its fur was white and patchy, matted with tunnel grime and slime. Underneath the fur, I could see thick pink skin covered in old scars. It was crouched on all fours, its powerful shoulders hunched high. It had a long canine snout, wrinkled back in a permanent snarl. Its ears were flattened against its skull. But it was the eyes that terrified me. They were huge, glowing amber orbs with vertical slit pupils. They weren't animal eyes. They were focused, intelligent. It pressed its wet black nose against the windshield. It sniffed. It knew I was in there. It could smell the heat. It could smell the fear. I had to move this train, now. I reached for the engine control panel. My fingers fumbled with the isolation switch, flipping it to start. "Come on," I whispered. "Come on, old girl." I pressed the start button. Whir chug. The starter motor engaged. The massive diesel engine turned over slowly. Chug, chug. It was cold. It didn't want to wake up. The sound of the engine startled the beast. It reared back, sitting up on its hind legs like a man. It towered over the cab, easily 7 feet tall. It roared, a sound that vibrated through the glass and into my chest. Room boom. The diesel engine caught. The floor vibrated as the cylinders began to fire. The RPM needle jumped up. But the engine running wasn't enough. I needed air. The compressor started thumping, pumping air into the tanks. I watched the pressure gauge. 10 psi. It takes 90 psi to release the brakes on a train this size. I was at 10. The dogman didn't like the noise. It attacked. Bam! It slammed a massive, clawed fist against the windshield. The glass is reinforced, 2 inches of laminate designed to stop a cinder block. It held. Bam! It hit the same spot again. Harder. I saw the muscles ripple under its white fur. I watched the air gauge, 25 psi. Faster, I yelled at the compressor. Bam! Crack! A sound like a gunshot filled the cab. A white starburst appeared in the center of the windshield, right where the creature's claws had struck. The dogman paused. It tilted its head, listening to the sound of the breaking glass. It understood. The barrier wasn't invincible. It raised both hands, clasping them together into a single, heavy sledgehammer. It bared its yellow fangs, saliva dripping onto the hood. It was going to hammer its way in. 35 psi. I grabbed the throttle handle. I didn't care about the brakes anymore. I was going to drag this train with the wheels locked if I had to. Crack! The spiderweb fracture grew. It stretched across the entire left side of the windshield. A small piece of glass flaked off inside the cab and tinkled onto the dashboard. The beast howled, a sound of pure triumph. It drew its arms back for a killing blow. 45 psi. It wasn't enough, but I had no choice. Hold on, I screamed. I ripped the throttle handle all the way back to notch 8, full power. The creature's fists came down at the exact same second the engine screamed. When you dump 4,400 horsepower into the axles of a locomotive all at once, the machine doesn't just accelerate, it explodes into motion. The General Electric diesel engine screamed, a deafening roar that shook the filings out of the floor mats. The main generator dumped a massive load of electricity into the traction motors. The steel wheels spun wildly on the rails, screeching like banshees as they fought for grip against the locked brakes. Sparks showered the tunnel walls, lighting up the dark in blinding white flashes. The sudden violence of the movement saved my life. The albino dogman on the nose of the train wasn't ready for it. It had raised its fist for the final death blow, balancing on its spindly rear legs. When the train lurched forward, physics took over. The creature's claws slipped on the wet, slick steel of the hood. Its legs buckled. It flailed, trying to grab the windshield wipers, trying to anchor itself, but the momentum was too strong. I watched, my heart in my throat, as it slid backward off the nose. It vanished from view. A split second later, I felt it. Thump! The locomotive rose up slightly, then slammed back down. Crunch grind. The sound came from beneath my feet. It was a wet, sickening noise, like a bag of wet cement going through a wood chipper. The train shuddered as 12,000 tons of steel rolled over the obstacle, grinding it into the ballast. I didn't let off the throttle. I kept it pinned to the wall. Go, I screamed, my hands gripping the controls so hard my fingers were numb. The air pressure finally built up enough to release the brakes. The resistance vanished. The train surged forward, picking up speed, 20 miles an hour, 30, 40. The tunnel walls blurred past the side windows, a streaking nightmare of gray concrete and water. I was waiting for another sound. I was waiting for the roof to buckle. I was waiting for a claw to punch through the floor. But there was only the roar of the engine and the rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels. I stared straight ahead through the spiderweb cracks of the windshield. In the distance, a tiny pinprick of white light appeared. The exit. I didn't slow down. I ran that train like a getaway car. The dot of light grew bigger, expanding until it filled the whole view. We hit the tunnel mouth at 60 miles an hour. The transition was blinding. 1 second, I was in the suffocating dark of the Helix Tunnel. The next, I was bursting into the brilliant, golden morning of the Appalachian Mountains. The sun hit the shattered glass of the windshield, turning the cracks into a glowing wall of diamonds. I squinted against the light, gasping for air. The smell of rotting fur and musk was sucked out of the cab, replaced by the scent of pine trees and diesel. I was out, I was safe. I grabbed the radio handset. We were out of the rock now. We had a signal. Mayday, mayday, I yelled, my voice cracking. This is CSX train Q692. I have an emergency. My conductor is down. Repeat, conductor is down. The dispatcher's voice came back, crackly but clear. Q692, copy your emergency. What is your status? I looked back at the dark mouth of the tunnel receding behind us. It looked like a black eye in the side of the mountain. I hit something, I stammered. There was an obstruction in the tunnel, requesting police and medical at the next yard. I didn't tell them about the white beast with the amber eyes. I didn't tell them about the broken chains in car number 7. I just drove. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the Clifton Forge rail yard, 20 miles away. The investigation lasted for weeks. They found the traces of the obstruction on the tracks. They found the white fur matted into the front grille of my engine. They found the empty boxcar with the shattered chains. And they never found Kowalski. They listed him as lost in transit, presuming he fell off the train during the emergency stop. The railroad company tried to bury it. They called it a freak accident involving an escaped exotic animal. They paid for my silence with a fat settlement check and a transfer to a desk job. But they had to review the tapes. Modern locomotives are equipped with forward-facing cameras. They record everything in front of the train. 3 weeks later, a safety official called me into a small, windowless room. He looked pale. He didn't say a word. He just pressed play on a laptop. I watched the grainy, black and white footage. I saw the tunnel darkness. I saw the massive, Albino Dogman drop from the ceiling onto the nose of the train. I saw it rear up, exposing its scarred face and needle teeth. I saw it hammer on the glass. But then the official paused the video. "Look closer, Ford," he whispered. He zoomed in on the creature's face. I stared at the freeze frame. I had been so terrified in the moment, so focused on the fangs, that I had missed the body language. The creature wasn't snarling. Its mouth was open in a silent scream. Its head wasn't tilted forward looking at me. It was tilted back. It was constantly checking the darkness behind it, It was frantic. It was banging on the glass, not to attack me but to get in. It was desperate. The muddy trail in the tunnel, it went from the back of the train to the front. The creature had realized the train was a steel box, a fortress. I felt a chill go through my bones that was colder than the tunnel air. I looked at the official. He just closed the laptop. "We're sealing the tunnel," he said. I walked out of that office and never looked back, but I still dream about that white face in the window. I finally understood what I was seeing. The creature wasn't trying to break in to kill me. It was trying to get inside, to hide from the thing that was coming down the tunnel behind us.